Today I'll be meeting with MaryAnne McFarland, a licensed clinical social worker here in Bountiful. And what are we going to discuss today?
Today we're going to talk about how to make the transition between parent time from one home to another a little easier on the children.
All right, before we go any further then, tell us about your practice and your contact information for anyone that would like to reach you.
Right. My name is MaryAnne McFarland. I'm the clinical director of Leafcrest Counseling. We have two offices. We have one in Bountiful, Utah and one in Ogden, Utah. We specialize mostly in children, adolescents, families. We do have some individuals, but our main practice and focus is on children, adolescents, and family counseling. We have a website, www.leafcrestcounseling.com. You can reach our offices at 801-510-6864.
And we'll also repeat that at the end, just so people, if they want to get that information and jot it down again. So I'll remind us at that point. The transition between homes. Let me tell you a couple of things I hear about as a divorce lawyer. Okay. The children are always sad when they leave my house, whoever's house that might be, and don't want to leave. Let's start with that. What's behind that?
Right. Oftentimes, children are very intuitive, and oftentimes they are picking up on maybe some ambiguity of the parents. There's oftentimes some inappropriate discussion about the opposite parent going on in the home. And oftentimes, really, truly, the children really are sad to leave one house or the other. That's where they're comfortable. And that is a really difficult transition time for the children, and it's really confusing for the parents.
It was a revelation to me when I heard somebody say, and I believe it was a child psychologist or counselor, who said, it should come as no surprise if the children love a parent that they would be sad to leave. That doesn't mean they dread going back to the other parent's house necessarily. It just means they're saying, well, we've had a good time together, and I know I'm not going to see you for a while, and I'm sad about that. But that doesn't mean that, because a lot of parents, as you can guess, come to the lawyers and say, let's tell the judge that my son is always sad when he has to leave. And like, well, there may be more to that, but it may simply be, I'm sad to be leaving from a comfortable, familiar place and knowing that I won't see you in a while.
Exactly. And that is why when I talk to families, I get that same thing where they say, oh, but my child's really doesn't want to leave my house, says I don't want to go to dad's house or mom's house, whoever's house. And we talk about a lot of ways to make that transition easier. For the very young children, they're simply going to miss the other parent while they're at the opposite parent's home.
You also mentioned inappropriate things are discussed. Now that's a nice wishy-washy, nebulous thing, and I'm sure that you can elaborate on that. But this is important because a lot of people will actually say in their pleadings, inappropriate things were discussed, which leaves people like me or a judge to go, well, I guess that all depends on what you mean by inappropriate.
Right.
So let's define what that is.
Okay.
What's a way that you can make things hard on a child by having inappropriate discussions about the other parent?
Right. Inappropriate is a real clinical ambiguity. But oftentimes parents have a lot of emotional feelings towards the opposite spouse. That's why they're not living together. That's why they chose a divorce. And oftentimes there's a lot of grumbling or one-upmanship. One parent tries to tell the children while they're at their house how much better they are or how much worse the other parent is. And that gives the child a really, really tough feeling of being in the middle because they actually love both parents, and it's hard for them to hear disparaging remarks about either parent.
And let's talk a little bit, let's talk even more bluntly about, there's many times when one parent is, if you were keeping stats, clearly head and shoulders a better parent than the other, without that parent being an unfit parent.
Right.
So what's wrong with reminding the children all the time about how superior you are to your ex and how important it is for them to recognize that and be grateful, and I'm not playing the heavy. You need to do your homework so that you'll get into a good college. And that flaky dad of yours, he didn't go to college. He wouldn't understand. Or do you want to end up like him, working as a ditch digger the rest of your life? I mean, what's wrong with that?
Well,
you're simply being,
yeah.
you're just being honest with the kids and letting them know that you've worked hard and you've made sacrifices and you're more disciplined. Why shouldn't you let the kids know you're a better parent than your ex?
Well, you're at that point. You're trying to ask a child to be more loyal to you because they should be more grateful to you because you've done so much for them. Kids don't come with a loyalty and grateful gene. And the reality is that they love both their parents no matter what. And if you say one thing against the other parent, it just makes them feel more defensive of the parent that you're talking down to.
I have an interesting perspective, I believe, and that is my mom has died. I'm okay with that. But I can say this because, I mean, I don't have to worry about offending my mom or dad. But my mom was not as smart as my dad. My mom was plenty smart. She had gone to college. Not that you have to go to college, but they were both college educated. But my dad was far more academic and intellectual than my mom was. And so every now and then my mom would say something that was kind of like, well, it's not true. You know, like she'd make an error about physics, about why something happens, and my dad would, who was a dentist, and so he'd taken a lot of science, and he was like, you know, sometimes he'd kind of chuckle or sometimes he'd kind of roll his eyes, but he wasn't doing it to be mean-spirited. But I knew that my dad knew more about the way the world works than did my mom. I knew that my mom was a little more of she was a psychology teacher. So she wasn't weird, but she was, you know, she liked to kind of see the reasons behind what people did, and kind of as opposed to my dad, who was actually very insensitive to that, and he would kind of think that it was all nature and it was all genes and it had nothing to do with free will. You know? But I never said, well, because I know my dad is more intellectual than my mom, I love my mom less. I actually love them both as two different people.
Correct.
So I think it's funny when somebody might say, well, I'm better than your other parent in this area, and therefore I'm better overall. I think it's interesting you mentioned that the kids can love their parents, and they don't keep score. I never said, well, I love my mom less when she's not as bright as dad.
Correct.
And I didn't say, and I love dad less when he's more judgmental than mom. I may have been upset or I may have been disappointed, but I still loved them both. What's to be said to people that are trying to compete for loyalty and affection?
When I see parents that are trying to compete for loyalty and affection, I tell them very much that the children love both parents, and the children need whatever the parent brings to the table. Like you pointed out, one person was more intellectually brighter than the other, but the other parent had brought something else to the table. Every parent brings something to the table, and it really doesn't matter on the parent's perspective if I'm providing a better home. For example, I have parents that come in and say that we're providing stability and the other home is chaotic. You know what? The child just wants to be with their parent, and they love their parent, and adults need to understand that the children aren't really part of their differences, and they don't understand the differences. This is my mom, she's perfect. This is my dad, he's perfect. And that's the way it is.
And what may appear chaotic to the other parent is something that the other child may take in stride.
Exactly.
They may not even notice differences, but even if they do, they're saying, oh yeah, things are much more mellow at parent X's house. And that's nice when I want mellow, but things are a little more chaotic or energetic. But you know what? There's virtue in that too. They may not even realize it, but they can take it in stride. And I think a lot of, and now I see the value, and I'm going to ask you about this too. I see the value in consistency about bedtime is the same at both parents' house. Now I don't know, because I've never talked to you about this or anybody else. I'm just bringing this up for the first time. Maybe bedtimes don't have to be consistent in both parents' homes, or you know, like the hygiene routines, or opinions about homework. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I can see, just as kind of an intuitive thing, that if bedtime is the same at both parents' homes, that child is going to have a routine and there's going to be a measure of stability. Let's talk a little bit about that though. If somebody complains about, it's very important that bedtime always be 8 o'clock, and the other parent says, well, you know, it's important to get a good night's rest, but 8, 8:30, 9, 9:30, you know, we never stay up too late, but I mean, I'm not going to put a child in bed when he's bouncing off the walls or wide awake and going to lie in bed for an hour. I hated that when I was a kid. So let's talk a little bit about routines. How much routine or how much unity do divorced parents have to have when raising children?
You know, it's the best, when you talk about routines, that is helpful. However, it's only helpful if the child is having behavior problems as far as going to bed. If dad doesn't have a problem with his bedtime routine and mom doesn't have a problem with her bedtime routine, fabulous. It really, but however, there should be some consistency as far as talking about schedules, talking about when the visitation's going to be. In the bigger picture, that's more of what the children worry about than if at dad's house I get to run around the house till I fall asleep in front of the TV, and mom's house I have to go to bed at 7:30, and if I get out of bed then there's a consequence or whatever have you.
So consistency for consistency's sake is not the point.
It's not the point. Unless the parents come to me and say, a dad will come to me and say, well, I don't understand it, you know, this child acts out, this is what's going on, then we explore, well, what's the routine? Maybe this child is a very structured routine child and this disruption in the routine has set them off.
Okay.
But if there's no problem, then let it go.
And complaining about the bedtimes being too late,
Yeah.
as long as this child isn't falling asleep in school
Exactly.
or something like that, it's like,
Exactly.
look, let's be grateful that it isn't a problem
Right.
with routine.
Right.
So we've dealt with, you know, the competing for loyalty, or for, you know, like as if love is an exhaustible resource and I've got more of a child's love than the other. We've talked about being critical. We talked about routines. What are some of the other things that divorcing parents may lose sight of, even though their hearts are in the right place when they deal with?
They lose sight of the fact that when the child, especially young children, or a lot of times I'll get parents in that'll say, well, whenever this child's at my house, they want to call mom every night. And I don't want that. This is my parent time. And the reality is they lose sight of the fact that that child's just missing mom and just wants to hear that voice. And so I give them a lot of direction on how to make the parent time, that transition easier so that it's not distressful on the child. Parents see it as if this child wants to call mom every night, then they see it as a direct reflection on them that they're not.
I'm unhappy to be with dad,
Right.
because I want to call mom.
Right. They don't see it as, no, really, they just really want to hear from mom. Now, there are the families where that is the case, where there's a triangulation and stuff going on, but we're not talking about that today.
No, we're not. Yeah, exactly. So we're not talking about parental alienation and
Correct.
all those, and maybe one parent who's got some mental illness problems or
Correct.
personality disorders. We're talking about two people that have their hearts in the right place, but there's still a lot of friction.
Right.
And that friction is arising from some bad advice or some old, what would I say, old wives' tales, for lack of a better term, about, it's very important. Like, bedtime's always one that I hear about in my line of work. We don't have a consistent bedtime, or they don't brush their teeth at one parent's house and they do it at the other. Now, my dad is a dentist. It's very terrible not to brush teeth, but in the great scheme of things, unless the children have really bad teeth and they're prone to cavities, you are not married anymore. This parent gets to set his or her own rules.
Exactly.
And the point is, the good news is the kids aren't, correct me if I'm wrong, the kids are not suffering as much as you might think.
Correct.
If you're a worrying and fretful parent because the routine is changing in one parent's home, that doesn't necessarily mean the children are consciously or even unconsciously being harmed.
Correct. Correct. And oftentimes parents getting over involved in that idea of routine, like they're not serving nutritious foods over there. I know that dad or mom is just providing them with chips and pop, and I don't want these children to have chips or pop, is really more of causing an anxiety within the children. Because then they go to dad's house, they've heard mom say, we don't have chips and pop, then now they want chips and pop because they're a regular kid. And so there's a lot of anxiety caused by that kind of contention, when things could go much easier if it's just, at our house we don't have chips and pop, when you're at dad's house he's your parent, and he can make that decision then.
So here's another question then. What should a divorced parent who is worried about the effect of a divorce on a child, his or her mental health and emotional health, and maybe the stigma that they're afraid of, or just the loss of two parents under the same roof? We've talked about things that can distract parents. We've talked about some of the myths, and we've dispelled some of those. So if there were like top three or something, what would be the thing? I'm just kind of thinking about, is being a good example of a solid citizen something good for kids? You know what I mean? Like saying, I'm honest, or or should you try to work on being more loving? And I don't mean just by being by feigning affection, but should you try to hug your kid every day? Should you compliment them every day, even though you may not have been prone to do that in the past? I mean, you want it to be you know what I'm saying? But
right.
Should you make sure you're showing? Should you go out of your way to give money to the bums on the street? Should you make sure that you're attending church on a regular basis? What are some rules? You know what I mean? In other words, not worrying about some of the differences in households. Mm-hmm. What are some things you can do as a parent to really give your kids a solid foundation when they're with you, and to make sure you're giving them as best an upbringing you can as a single divorced parent?
Well, if you're talking about as a single divorced parent, bringing them up a good upbringing.
In other words, trying to compensate for the loss of that nuclear family.
If you try to compensate, what usually happens is by the time a child's a teenager, they up the ante on you.
Meaning what?
Meaning that they know, children, again, are very intuitive. They know what's genuine, they know what's not. So if before you weren't giving money to bums off the street, if before you weren't hugging them and giving them extra compliments, kids very quickly learn that, this is a behavior, a compensation behavior. And then as they become teenagers, it's they see that you want to be a good citizen and the dad's trying to be a good citizen, so maybe I can negotiate some kind of triangulation here for my benefit.
Even though you're not trying to one-up your ex?
No, but kids are very, very, very intuitive, and they're going to know that you are not genuine. If you want to set a good foundation for your child, be the best parent that you know how to be, because most parents do parent the best that they know how. Be the best parent you want to be. Be very in tune to the fact that they do love the opposite parent. Is it okay to send a picture of you and the children to the opposite home? Yeah, do that. Is it okay if you have a very young child who misses you when you're at dad's house? Have them wear one of your dirty sweatshirts with your smell on it to take over to the opposite house, so they have your smell, so they have that comfort. Kids will love you as you parent, but the reality is you just have to be your authentic self.
What if, let's not talk about, again, like the crazy ex-spouse, but what if one of the reasons for the divorce was that there were differences of opinion about the upbringing of children?
Yes.
And so sending over that sweatshirt or that picture, the other spouse, right or wrong, says, I really do want to diminish the influence of your mother or father when you're with me. Or, I've remarried, and this is the better spouse. This is the spouse I deserved, and your mother or father really did have some serious flaws. Nothing criminal, but thank goodness that person's not in our lives anymore. What do you say to kids or that parent who's trying to basically, and I see this a lot in people that are otherwise good folks, they really do try to just marginalize that other parent.
And that backfires on you.
Always?
Not always. Not always.
Okay, then here's a double question then. What about the kids that actually seem to warm to this step parent and to the efforts of this parent who believes that he or she is on the side of the angels by marginalizing the other parent? What are we doing to this kid?
Well, you are taking away their parent from them. And you are separating them from their parent, and you're alienating them from their parent.
But what if this child actually seems... Is it possible for the child to seem to like it? And
absolutely. They will seem to like it, but... and it really depends. Now, we're not talking about the severely mentally challenged parent that
The alcoholic parent that you
the
divorced
stuff
and
that
stuff
the
like
kids
that.
are going, I don't ever want to go over there because of the situations that happened. But if you take two parents that divorce, and one parent is married to another person, and the children take to that parent, great, but they always know, unless they were tiny and never see the other parent, they always know who real mom or dad is. You can't make them in their emotional context say, well, my stepmom's now going to be my mom, and my mom's just going to be out there.
And let me give you a real world example. There are several, but here's one where a couple marries, and then one of them decides doesn't believe in God anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So they were a religious couple, and then one doesn't believe in God anymore, or one of them decides I don't agree with the teachings of the faith I was brought up in.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is this other parent, whose life has revolved around this faith, and it has served him or her quite well. They then remarry in that same faith again, but this other person's not, I don't believe in God anymore, so I don't go to church. So when the kids are with me, I won't take them to church. I don't have to, I don't want to. Nothing personal against my old faith. I don't hate it, although sometimes they do. But it's like, but I'm not going to take my kids to church when I don't believe it. I think that that's hypocritical. Some parents can take it or leave it and say, I'm not going to go, but I know the kids want the consistency and they see the value, and it's like, I'll take them.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, that parent that really clings to the faith, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with clinging to your faith, folks, but then they say, you know what, I know what I'm going to do. For the kids' protection, and since I have this new spouse, and we are faithful, and we are devout, we will simply come up with, like, you know what, there's something happening at church every week that's important, so I'm not going to let the kids come and see you on Sunday, or I'm going to pick them up on Sunday, and I'm going to try, and of course, maybe that parent catches on or doesn't, but they're just getting less time, less influence, subtle reminders about, what happens to people that leave the faith. They are spat out of the mouth of God, and they go straight to hell, and so the child might either be like, well, gee, I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to go to hell because. So within those confines, what do you do if you're the parent who left that faith? If you're that parent who became an atheist, what do you do when you see that happening?
Well, if this was a situation where your children were initially, probably this is a situation where maybe this is why you got a divorce. I don't even know.
Maybe you did, maybe you didn't.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Either way, whatever you're comfortable with,
right.
You can take the scenario from here.
So I tell parents, look, you need to get together on this, because we know that in our society, your religion, your affiliation or not your affiliation, is kind of important. And so you either say, if you're a non-believer in a certain faith or God or whatnot, say, fabulous, that's your belief. But if your children are used to going to a faith, or your spouse feels really strongly that they should be exposed to a faith, raised in a particular belief system, then you need to say to yourself, we have to pick one or the other. We can't do back and forth, because what ultimately happens is not only do you cause anxiety and guilt in the child, because if they're being in a religion and they're being taught that not to go to church or not to practice their faith, they're going to go to hell, causes them extreme anxiety because they're still going to want to see mom. And not only that, at some point you're going to cause that some children are going to side with mom, some children are going to side with dad as they age. And then you've got even more of a fissure in the family.
But if that bastard hadn't left the faith, we wouldn't have this problem.
That's just the way it worked out. That's his personal choice. But the children, this is a case where the parents say, this is my very personal conviction, and now we're at odds with it, and we're going to put the children, and we're going to go the back and forth. When you're at mom's, you're not going to church, or whoever, you're not going to go to church at this parent's. When you're at this parent, you're going to go to church. Back and forth. It really diminishes what you're trying to do on either side.
So now that's interesting. Did you ever see that movie about Gandhi where, that guy, he's a Christian that kills a Muslim, and he says, I think, or the other way around. Mm-hmm. And Gandhi, who I believe was a Hindu, he goes, but I'm torn up with guilt. I don't know what to do. I feel so terrible. What should I do? And he said, go and take the son of the man you killed, who was a Muslim, and raise him as a Muslim, even though you fought over it was a conflict between Christians and Muslims. You are a Christian. Raise that child as a Muslim, even though you think that is anathema to you. That is the worst thing you can do. And it's a great scene. The guy's eyes go really wide, but you can tell that he's like, look, I really trust Gandhi, and I can see he's a very peaceful, loving, nonviolent man. I'm trying to rid my soul of this guilt and anguish over being violent and taking a life. I want to do something right. Now, that's interesting, because I can see some people that would say, well, I'm condemning my child. This is my child's salvation, and if I let the child choose, or actually not let the child choose, obviously the child can choose eventually, but if I decide, it's like, you know what, my antagonistic ex-spouse is so antagonistic, my efforts to be a good atheist, or my efforts to be a good believer are actually harming the child, I'm going to let go. What do you tell the parent who says, you know what, I'll just let the child, if the child wants to go to church, who, by the way, doesn't like it right now, it's much more fun to sleep in and watch cartoons and go to church. What is that? How do you console that parent? Because do you see the tension?
Right.
I don't want this child to suffer because of the disputes between parents. But I also feel like I'm abandoning my obligation to bring up this child properly.
Right. That is a piece of grief, because you have lost part of what your expectations for yourself are as a parent. This is how you thought you would parent. This is how you wanted to parent. These are your children, and you can't do that. So now it's a piece of grief, and you're going to grieve whatever your belief is if they're lost souls. And it also kind of makes you feel like you're grieving part of your lost yourself as a parent. I'm not as good of a parent because I got a divorce, and now I can't raise my children in my faith the way I want to.
So now I'm responsible for them going to hell through no fault of my own.
And so then you have to work on your grief and your guilt, and that's a big issue.
But there are people who can reconcile it, aren't there?
There are. It's usually, I try to work with the parent who doesn't want their children to go to church, and not because I'm biased in either way, but because it's a little bit easier for them to let go than the parent who really has a religious preference.
And thank you for being so pragmatic about it. You're saying, hey, sometimes you pick your battles.
Right.
And this person, the religious person, may be a little more entrenched, and as long as you don't feel like the kids are turning into crazies or being harmed or being taught that you're worthless pieces of crap, you might say, all right, they are a nice group of people over there at church. And they are trying to teach people honesty and kindness and fairness to your fellow man. I think they're weird when it comes to this, and I don't like their teachings about guilt for this or guilt for that, or, especially if one of the parents is gay and comes out of the closet. And I don't, and they can, I expect, and I'm a Christian if you didn't figure that out, but they may say, I don't like the way they teach, they are unfair to gay people, or they are condemnatory of gay people. Whether that's true or not, but they still feel that way. You're saying that person might just go, all right, pick my battles, and just realize that it may not be as bad as they had thought. Now let's flip it around. So the religious parent says, obviously, I didn't want my religion to be a chore. I didn't want it to be a burden to the kids. I wanted it to be a benefit to their life. My ex is making this now. My religion is now a wedge. I don't want it to be, but whatever I do, anytime I say, hey, can the child be baptized? Can the child go to this event and go to this pageant, or whatever it is? This was supposed to be a happy thing, and when the parents are united, it would have been. Now it's been completely turned on its head. Is that something you can live with as a parent yourself? Where you say, you know what? Yes, I'm not insisting this child be baptized. Yes, I'm not insisting this child do what I think is important and was a real help to me. But I'm doing it because I will be taking what was otherwise a good thing that has now been turned into garbage. Am I getting it? Can people accept that? Do they actually not feel like putting a bullet in their heads? Can they go on with life and not feel like failures, or do they just have to?
They can, but again, the person that is really entrenched in their religion, it's so much a part of their core values that it really is hard for them to let that go.
Okay, so I think I see something. What you're saying there is they're not just outlasting you if you're the other parent.
Right.
They're not out competing you. What it is that it is so much a part of them that they
Yes.
you might as well ask them to cut off a limb.
Yes. Yes.
Hey, what's the big deal about church? Like, well, you have 2 arms. Why don't you just cut off one of your arms?
Right.
You've still got 1 arm. It'll be a bit of a hassle, but right?
Right.
Okay, I get it then.
Yeah.
So in other words, don't see this parent as just stubborn and
Right.
bullheaded.
Right.
This is like saying it's like just cut off a couple of fingers.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's crazy. Well, it's, just I don't want them to go to church every week. That's
Right.
horrible.
Right.
They really do believe it.
Yes.
They're not doing it as it's not a power play. It can be.
It can be, but it's usually not. I don't see it as usually not. I really do see, oftentimes I get that situation, and it really is, they are torn up about this. This is who they are. And oftentimes, both parents, when they first married, were joined on it, and then one parent, for another reason or another, decides that religion or faith or belief is not working for them.
Right.
But the other parent hasn't lost that. And so now, what do you do with that?
Right. Now, of course, I use that as an example, but we could do all kinds of things. We could talk about, again, we could have, there's homosexuality, same scenario. There's substance abuse, where it may have been, even whether we're dealing with Mormons in the state of Utah or non-Mormons, it could be that the couple was social drinkers and then one became an alcoholic, or
Right.
became alcohol dependent, or
Right.
alcohol abusing, or someone who says, I think we should have an open marriage,
Right.
or all sorts of things. I mean, like politics or whatever it is, but I use religion because that's very common.
Yes.
And I think many of us, whether we've gone through it personally or have a friend or family member, we've seen it. But that was the point. Before we wrap up then, do you have any thoughts on what you think the default child custody and parent time arrangements should be? Every parent or every family is unique, but what are some guiding principles that if you were talking to a court, or if you were talking to other parents or their attorneys, what would you say is like, hey, I don't have a dog in this fight. I just want the families and the kids to be happy and to move on as best they can after divorce.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of arrangements do you think are best? And you can pick, if it's age dependent, go ahead and tell us,
Right.
for this child or that child or whatever.
Well, the one that I have, of the divorces that I've seen that have worked really well with children are the ones where there's liberal visitation on both sides. Now, that is really hard because in divorces there's too much contention about that, and then there's the financial issues that go along with that. But the reality is when we have liberal visitation, when one child says, I just want to go see dad tonight, or I want to go spend the weekend with dad, fabulous. That way we get parents who are actually communicating more on the liberal visitation, because they've got to actually pick up a phone call the other person, work out, hey, can I see the kids tomorrow? Can I take them to a movie? I've got plans, can you have them? And the children really get a sense of united co-parenting rather than, nope, you can't go.
It's not your weekend.
It's not your weekend. Or I don't care if they're all going to a trip, it's not your weekend. Or I need you back before their trip is over because that's my parent time. And that seems to cause the most anxiety with children. It makes them feel too separate. But if parents can get together and work out a really liberal visitation schedule, and that really ultimately forces them to get along better.
Should it be balanced between the parents? Should it be that there's equal time, or are you just saying it should be that there's an understanding that they can spend time with both parents and they're not going to be
There's nobody
punished for
keeping, there's no keeping score.
What about balancing it out? What about equal time? Or is there do you have any opinions on that either way?
No, I think that it works out, and actually it'll work out to the benefit of the child. If one parent feels there's really liberal visitation, then they're going to be less hesitant to call the parent and say, I've got to work on the weekend, or I've got to work, can you watch the child, and then I'll pick them up after work. And they work out what's really best, and the child really feels like they are being parented by both parents. And it doesn't matter if they spend, as lifestyles change, they spend more time with dad, and then maybe in a couple of years it's more time with mom. A child really doesn't keep that kind of score unless they find out that a parent says, no, I don't want the child for the weekend. Unless that goes on, then they keep score.
They do.
Yeah.
Interesting. This has been I'm so grateful that you're just willing to talk about what you really believe and what you've really experienced, as opposed to some of that kind of superficial, well, love kids and do what's best for them and child's best interest. Did you notice neither one of us used the term,
Yes.
the best interest of the child, the entire time we were having this discussion?
Yes.
How bracing. Thank you so much. And before we finish, would you just give them one more time your name, your practice, and your contact information?
Right. My name is MaryAnne McFarland. Our practice is Leaf Crest Counseling. We have an office in Ogden and one in Bountiful. You can see our website at www.leafcrestcounseling.com. You can call our offices. Either office has the same number, 801-510-6864.
Thank you again.
Okay. Thanks for having me.